You hear me? Great. We're doing a little bit of an experiment, and that is because the Minister of Culture is speaking in the space adjacent to us, and we were not going to compete with them, but now we decided we are. So you all have been waiting very patiently. It feels like we should just begin. So if you can't hear us, raise your hand and complain, and we will do our best to speak more loudly, right?
Right, right.
And I'll remind Rosalind to speak very closely into her microphone. So I am Sarah Meister. I am the executive director of Aperture, which is a nonprofit organization based in New York that has been publishing a magazine about photography since 1952. So that was 70 years ago. Rosalind remembers it well. I was not born. And I am a longtime fan of Rosalind Fox Solomon's work, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be invited to have a conversation with her this evening for Pari Photo. So thank you, Rosalind, for inviting me.
And it's my pleasure to speak with you.
Okay. Yeah, you have to hold it super close to your mouth. Ready? Like this,
What?
even closer.
Okay. Now
Okay.
can you hear me?
We'll work on it. I promise you'll hear every word. I want to thank the Pari Photo team for organizing everything so beautifully and helping us co-manage. It's not every day the Minister of Culture shows up at a photo fair. We want to support that support, so that's good. I also want to thank the Muse Collection for their display of Rosalind's work and their preservation of her achievement, which is on view right down at the end of this column, and to Natalie Hirschdorfer, who's back there, for having curated such an extraordinary collection of Rosalind's early work. Yeah, we'll just... And in addition, there is another display of Rosalind's work at Julian Saunders Gallery, and which is just a little bit further into the fair, and an extraordinary opportunity to see some of the prints that we'll be talking about today from pictures in the time of AIDS, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, and we'll also talk about Julian and his father's long relationship with Rosalind. So. You'll forgive me if so you ready?
Yes, let's
Okay.
start.
So in the interests of being respectful of having a conversation with somebody who has been photographing for decades and decades and decades, I thought I took the liberty of writing out a few questions and sharing them with Rosalind in advance to say, no surprises. So you'll forgive us for not having, we might ask one or two questions at the end from the audience, if you feel up to it.
Sure.
But in general, no surprises. We're gonna start at the beginning, but the beginning for Rosalind was when she was 38 years old, which is older than several of you who are here in terms of her beginning with photography. So I thought we'd begin by asking you, what was it, Rosalind, at age 38 that made you want to be a photographer? And
Well,
how did that happen?
It happened for
Even closer, like almost touch it to your lip. Yeah.
It happened for me in Japan when I was there for an exchange organization, and I stayed with the Japanese family, and they didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Japanese.
Even a little closer. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't speak any Japanese, and they didn't speak any English. So I had a little Instamatic with me, and I started taking pictures. And when I got back to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I lived, I showed my pictures. They were slides, and my friend said, "Oh, these are really good. Why don't you keep taking pictures? These are good." So I kept taking pictures, and that's how I started.
So it was your friends. My friends were never so encouraging of my photography when I was younger, but that's okay. We won't go there. So soon thereafter, though, you actually set up a darkroom to start making prints.
Yes.
Who taught you how to do that?
A newspaper photographer who was a friend of mine came and he spent about 2 hours with me, set up the trays, and I never saw him in my darkroom again.
So that's quite a photo education. You get going, your friends tell you you make good pictures, the photographer from the Chattanooga Times sets up your darkroom and leaves.
Yes.
And then essentially you're on your own. You're taking pictures, you have 2 teenage children still living at home.
Yes.
You're working.
Yes.
You know, that's a lot to balance.
Yes, I wasn't very good in the darkroom at that point, to tell you the truth. I ended up having to send some things to a lab.
There's
But
no
eventually
shame in
I
that.
learned.
Many of the great photographs on view here were made in a lab.
But eventually I became a good printer.
Hold
Eventually I became a good printer.
So I know, because I've been doing my homework, that one of the labs that was making your prints at this time was Modern Age
Yes.
in New York. Will you talk a little bit about, you're living in Chattanooga. Tell us a little bit about going to New York and Modern Age. What was that like?
Well, they gave me a vice chairman or somebody. They appointed somebody to talk to me about my work and to help me with thread my way through the company. And eventually they invited me to a Christmas party. I couldn't go. And then the next year they asked me again to the Christmas party. And finally, on the 3rd year, I was going to be in New York with my family, and I was able to go to the Christmas party. And as I left the Christmas party, I met someone who said she was a photographer's agent. And I said, oh, that's exactly what I need. I need an agent. Of course, I had only been shooting for about a few years, and the last thing I really needed was an agent. And she said, well, come and show me your work. So I came back. The next time I came to New York, I brought a big suitcase full of my work. And she looked at it, and she said, well, you're talented, but you need a lot of help. There's a lot you don't know. I think that you should study with Lisette Modell. I said, Lisette
None other
Modell?
than Lisette Modell.
Would she take me on? She said, I'll talk to her about it. So that's how I ended up studying with Lisette.
I mean, it's pretty amazing to think you knew you needed an agent, but you had enough confidence that you weren't so worried about the instruction. And when you got instruction, it's from none other than Lisette Modell. So what do you think? So Lisette Modell helped you move from a 35 millimeter camera into the square format camera that's really the hallmark of what we think of, what I think of when I think of your work. What else did Lisette teach you?
Oh, Lisette taught me that my work was the most important thing in the world that I could do, and that I should devote myself to it. I had already done organizational work in Chattanooga, and it was time for me to stop everything else and do my work in photography. And I listened to her. I didn't stop absolutely everything else, but little by little, I became 100% focused on photography.
And was there anything about your relationship with your subjects or anything about your photography that Lisette taught you?
Oh, she taught me a lot.
And what were you how would she teach you? What was that like?
She taught me to go for the extreme. She taught me to look at every part of the picture and to be sure to look at the sides and not just in the center. But most of all, she taught me to be bold. And she convinced me that she liked my work, and she told me that it was the most important thing that I could do. And I believed her. And that's how I continued.
I mean, I believe her too. I'm glad she said that. I thought it would be interesting to talk for a little bit about and I don't actually know the answer to this question, but there's some photographers who, like Lee Friedlander, he says that if he doesn't have a camera around his neck, he would fall backwards, that like carrying a camera with him is a part of, it's like breathing to him. And there are other photographers like Bill Brandt who say that he never takes out his camera except on assignment. He needs a reason to take out his camera. What about you? How often do you photograph? And you don't need to, you can say this retrospectively. We won't hold you to it tomorrow.
Okay.
If there was a different answer once.
I never carried a camera all the time. I did it in the very beginning, when I was doing 35 millimeter, I did tend to carry it quite a lot. But then I stopped, and I just carried my camera when there was something in particular that I wanted to do. What else was the rest of the question?
Well, yeah, that's it. So, but what made you want to do it? You know, how often was it that you went out with your camera?
Well, I began to work on the project that many of you may have seen, the first Mondays in Scottsboro.
This is the work that's on view in the Muse booth.
That was the first major project that I did. And I went there were 3 days a month that I went to Scottsboro, Alabama, and I photographed at that fair. I photographed while they were setting it up, and I photographed on 2 days when people were walking around the square. And and then I would develop the work and do my proof prints, and so it wasn't just taking the pictures.
Right.
Once I learned to begin to know how to print and to print decently, I wanted to print my own work.
So this is, we're talking about 1973 or so. You meet Lisette Modell and you start studying occasionally. You're living in Chattanooga, traveling to New York occasionally to study with her. And you were making astonishingly mature pictures almost immediately. The pictures that I think of as some of your iconic works, you're making those very, very early, by 1974, 75, including a picture that you showed to John Sharkovsky at the Museum of Modern Art in 1976 that he acquired for the museum collection, that he included in Mirrors and Windows 2 years later, which was a survey of American contemporary photography. That's a very rapid trajectory, and I'm just wondering if you remember anything of how you met John or anything about that moment.
I met John because Lisette Modell told me to take my work to MoMA and to John
I should have
Sharkovsky.
guessed.
Yes. So I took my work. The system then was that you took a portfolio and you dropped it off, and a week later you could come and pick it up. So I took my portfolio, and John Sharkovsky wanted to talk to me. And so he came out and he spoke to me, and he said, "I want to see everything that you do." So that's how I met John.
That's pretty good. And I will say, I started working at MoMA in 1994, and we were still doing portfolio reviews just like that for the first maybe 8 years or 10 years of working at MoMA. So that pattern really continued. But it wasn't that often that we would say, "We really want to talk to you, show me all your work." So that was a special thing.
And then I'll tell you something
Good.
that I did that wasn't a good thing. John Sharkovsky told me not to show my work too soon, because if I did, people were going to think that I was like Diane Arbus. But I did show my work too soon. And people thought that I was like Diane. He said, "But you're not." And people did think that, and I was very disturbed about that.
Yeah,
I couldn't get rid of it.
Well, I would say maybe that might be a lack of imagination or attention on the part of the viewer and had nothing to do with you at all. So I'm not so concerned about that. I will say there was a writer named Doreen St. Felix who writes for The New Yorker, and to speak to something that's very specific about your work and the work that you were making at around this time, she's talking about the work that you made at the Liberty Theater in Tennessee, which,
Yes.
do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Well, I lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and there was only one theater for people of color. And what else did I say about that?
That's fine. How did you know about the theater?
Okay, I have to say, my husband owned a chain of theaters, and there was only one for non-white people.
I mean, this was a reality. It's not an unfortunate reality for sure, but one, I think it.
You know, I lived there. I went to Chattanooga. I married somebody from Chattanooga. I was 23 years old, and I was very happy to get away from my family at that time. And I was pretty much involved with my own life. I ended up having a number of operations during the first years of my marriage, and I was always interested in international relations and in sociology, but I wasn't as aware as I became.
I think there are many of us who could say that same thing. So Doreen wrote about your work, and I'm going to quote her here because I think it's a really, really specific observation about something that you were doing with this series of pictures that was published as Liberty Theater. She writes, her name is Doreen. Rosalind Fox Solomon's vision of the American South pulls whiteness from its position as infinite and invisible background, as Zora Neale Hurston once wrote, to instead examine the white body as a site of difference. And she ended that paragraph with this: these extraordinary portraits and scenes are not quite documentary, but they pursue a truth about fear, pleasure, confusion, family history, and who and what whiteness feeds on in order to cohere. And I'm just wondering, do you remember how you felt when you read those words about your work and how...
That came
pretty late.
It
so
came
that's
relatively
yeah.
recently, and I was far away from that time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I had lived in New York for a long time when that article was written,
Mm-hmm.
so it was ancient history.
And what I liked about it, though, was that it took that ancient history and it showed us a little bit about what we could learn from looking at your pictures now. And I thought that's also the gift of the displays here, is thinking of something. That's one of the things a photograph does. It takes something that was made a long time ago and makes it into a relevant lesson for now. And your pictures keep doing that. So, and I think her observation helps me think about that personally. So maybe you alluded to the fact that you traveled, and I wanted to go back to some of your international work, which isn't on view in Perry Photo so much, but is really fantastic. And you participated in the Experiment for International Living right after you graduated, and their mission statement is this: our mission is to work globally to enhance the capacity and commitment of individuals, institutions, and communities to create a more sustainable, peaceful, and just world. And this was an organization you not only traveled as a part of that, but you also worked for them for many years. So what did that mission mean for you?
Well, first of all, I want to say that when I went with the Experiment in International Living to Belgium and France when I graduated from college. And the motto of the organization then was, we learn to live together by living together. Much simpler than the very pompous current motto.
Fair enough, fair enough. So what did you learn by living together?
Well, I think it changed my life, that trip right after I graduated from college, because it was, of course, my first trip overseas, and I lived in Belgium for a while, and then I bicycled in France with a group. And I spoke French. I learned what it meant to speak another language. I've lost most of it now, but and I learned about a totally different culture. So after that, I was, even though I had studied other cultures and history in college, my interest in other cultures increased, and I was fascinated by the Experiment in International Living. Ended up bringing groups into Chattanooga, Tennessee, and placing individuals with families in Tennessee. And then I actually worked for the Experiment, and I worked all over the South and set up programs for them. And I felt that this was a really important step toward introducing a lot of people to worlds that they were not familiar with.
That's amazing. To my mind, equally amazing is realizing I was looking at the countries that you traveled to alone. This is between 1968 and 1972. So within 4 years, you visited Japan, Thailand, Cambodia. This is right after starting with picking up a camera. Japan, Thailand, Cambodia, Israel, India, Nepal, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Portugal, Japan, Indonesia, New Guinea, and Australia. And that's just those first 4 years, and that continued. I thought I would love to ask you to speak a little bit about how it felt. What did you feel were the similarities or differences between photographing close to home, like you were doing for the Liberty Theater and the First Mondays, and photographing internationally?
Well, I found it very intriguing and interesting to photograph internationally. I was always interested in learning about the cultures where I traveled, and I just found it riveting to know people who had lived differently than I did. And I did take a lot of pictures where I lived. I did a lot of work in the South where I lived for 30 years. And then some of you may have seen the project, part of the project that I did, Portraits in the Time of AIDS. So I did work in the U.S., but I love to travel. And I guess I wanted to get away also from my personal life. And I felt some release when I traveled. I felt very independent. I also felt stronger as a woman, and I learned through my traveling to feel very strong. And that was a huge thing about traveling.
So you've mentioned that 1984 was a pivotal moment for you, and we'll get to that in 1 minute. But to my mind, 1979, so we'll go slowly toward the future. In 1979, you won a Guggenheim Fellowship, and you used that to photograph in Brazil and Peru. Do you remember how it was that you thought to apply for a Guggenheim Fellowship, or what that meant to you?
I guess I applied because I had learned that so many people who went on to do important work in photography had received Guggenheim Fellowships. And I think that Lisette recommended it to me. She was one of my references. And so that's why I applied. Now, what was the rest?
Yeah, and I think, it's amazing, 1980, right after you won that award, you began to get more and more attention. So Gerard Sonder, Julian's father, did an exhibition of your work in DC. You had a concurrent exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery, or roughly, I don't know exactly the months, at the Corcoran Gallery in DC, one at the Museum of Photographic Arts in San Diego, another at the George Eastman Museum. So it began, from my sort of retrospective position, at least, it looks like you began to get a little bit more momentum. Would you say that's true, or do you remember it that way?
I think that I did. I'm not sure that I appreciated as much as I should have at that time. Realized how important these things were, really.
That's okay. I mean, by the way, you were still young. You can learn to appreciate it. But by 1984, you had lived in New York for a few years. You were divorced. You moved to the Loft downtown, where you still live. And I'm just wondering, you describe almost as, in some of your oral histories, a sense of not feeling that integrated into the New York art scene at that moment, even though you had moved downtown. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I never really. There was a little bit of an art community in the building where I moved, so I did have that experience. But otherwise, I wasn't really part of any I didn't feel part of a bigger art community. I wasn't really conditioned to that, to knowing about it, or to thinking that that was important. So, yeah.
Were you going to galleries or museums, or were you?
I always went to museums. I didn't go very much to galleries. I did have a gallery. From time to time, I had galleries. Yeah.
But you're building your body of work even in relative isolation. You think that's a fair way of character? Or tell us about what was the community like even in your building?
Well, there were painters, and they encouraged me, and a sculptor, and I photographed a number of them, the people in the building. It was a small cooperative, and I was studying with Lisette in the beginning for a while, you know, and I just kept working.
And you know, kept working. You did, and I admittedly I have a little bit of an institutional bias, but in 1986, Peter Galassi curated an exhibition of your work called Rituals that was at the Museum of Modern Art, and he wrote this beautiful statement about the photographs of rituals that he put on view, and he said this. He said, Solomon's photographs of sacred or communal rites are richly descriptive, but they are not like the neutral documents of the anthropologist. The nominal function of a particular ceremony is of less interest than its psychological or spiritual intensity. For Solomon, the extravagant public theater of ritual is an expression of private feelings and struggles which she invites or compels the viewer to share. And I was wondering, I know you have some mixed feelings about how you think that show was received, but maybe we could tease apart how Peter and how MoMA felt about that work and how non-anthropological it was,
I feel that ritual is something that people use to cope with life. And that's what I was interested in, how other people cope with their lives, cope with their problems. And that's what compelled me to photograph ritual, in addition to the fact that it was, especially in the Latin American countries and in India, where I went to work, they were just particularly fascinating, particularly interesting events for me to photograph.
That's great. So, right after the MoMA show, there marks almost, I don't know if you would agree to characterize it as a break, but you really started doing a new series of work, and in fact, the series that Julian now has on view, Pictures in the Time of AIDS, which started at the height of the AIDS crisis in 1987, and in 1988, that work was shown at the Gray Art Gallery in New York. What was it that made you want to do that series? And maybe you'll talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you.
What made me want to do it was that I had just had a show at MoMA, and I had had a couple of other shows, and I felt as though I should do something to give back something, honestly. I heard about the AIDS epidemic, and I thought that it could be something interesting, a good thing for me to do, and that might be significant to other people.
By photographing it
by making it public.
By making it public.
Yes.
And so what was your strategy? How did you?
Well, I had no idea how I was going to do it, because I didn't really know anybody who had AIDS or who was close to that community that was getting AIDS. So someone at one of the hospitals that was receiving a lot of patients recommended, I told her, or some friend of mine told her, that I wanted to do this project, and I didn't know how to begin. And she said she had no idea, but a week later she got in touch with me, and she said, I have met somebody who I think will be able to help you. So it was a young priest. I think he was in his, probably not 25, and he was dedicating his life to working with people with AIDS. I met him, I took him some of my work, and he liked it. Actually, he does artwork himself. And he said, I'll help you, I want you to do this project. And he gave me names of his friends. I started by photographing some of the people that he knew. And then one thing led to another. And that's how I did the project. It seemed like an impossible thing to accomplish in the beginning.
Yeah, and so those, I mean, a year later, so you worked on this incredibly intensely. A year later, 75 of these prints, very large scale, almost 30 by 30 inches, which at the time was had some real heft and scope. These were pinned to the gallery walls of the Gray Art Gallery, which is part of NYU. And you've described that the reaction was mixed, which I imagine might have been an expression of the fear and confusion at the time and not necessarily the pictures themselves. But for you now, being able to see them on view at Julian's gallery, you know, do you want to talk a little bit about your varying points of reflection with that series for you?
Well, in the beginning, I was very upset that some people received the pictures negatively. Then, I mean, years later, the National Gallery of Art has just acquired the whole show. And
congratulations, by the way. That's really, really wonderful for the National Gallery. Wonderful for all of us, because the National Gallery is our, so.
Yeah, I feel like...
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So I feel that it's become, you know, it's become historic. And what was the rest of the question?
Well, just, yeah, no, how do you feel about it now? In other words, you...
Well, now, for a long time, I just couldn't look at the pictures because I knew the people, and it was very upsetting to me to relive it in, you know, currently. But finally, because finally the work started getting out again, and I did look back on it, and I came to terms with it. So, you know, I'm glad that I'm glad that the pictures exist.
And I'll say, actually, that body of work is an interesting counterpoint to what I'm going to say next, because I'm going to read you a quote of yours. So you said this. You said, rather than make people feel at ease, I find that some tension between me and the person I am photographing yields something more complex. And so while I think there is an ease and an intimacy with many of the portraits from the time of AIDS, I also thought it's interesting that for you to say you find the tension more interesting and more complex, which aligns with another quote of Doreen Saint-Felix's, which observed that sort of secrecy and distance might be, in their own way, more candid, more revealing than the common assumption that by getting to know someone better, you're taking a more authentic picture of them. And I would love to ask you to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I have to tell you that portraits in the time of AIDS, that was the only time that I actually talked to people, usually for about a half an hour before I photographed them. It is my custom to photograph people without having, especially people I don't know, not to have much conversation with them. Because I feel that people, if you just look at them, they get uncomfortable, but they become more involved with themselves, their inner selves. And that's really what I have wanted to capture. Not just the happy outside person. I want to get something a little deeper. So with most of my portraits, I haven't spoken to people.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the happy outside person is what I would characterize as a leitmotif of your career, but I do think that your career stands as a kind of counterpoint to the sense of what can you learn through that idea, through a commitment to what can't be known about that person, sort of through the surface.
Well, I usually would have my own ideas. As I'm photographing, I have my own ideas about maybe who this person is. And somehow when people are a little bit uncomfortable, I think that they are more self-revealing.
Except that when you and I are talking now, we won't do that. So selfishly, I have two more questions, and so if you all want to think of yours. My second to last question has to do with Aperture, where I got to know you and your work while I was a curator at MoMA. I was a longtime fan, and it was thrilling for me to join Aperture and learn that the very issue that came out the month I was joining was one that had a portfolio of your work in it. So I was hoping, this was in the New York issue of the magazine in spring of 2021. And so you had worked with Michael Famaghetti on that, and I was just wondering if you'd share a little bit of that recent history.
Well, Michael Famaghetti went through all of my New York proofs. I make small proofs before I make big prints, and selected what he liked, and he showed me, and he chose some things that I didn't even know that I had. They were not things that I had printed big. And in fact, the best picture, I couldn't believe it because I hadn't seen and recognized it before. So that was part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so my last question for you is that, we've been showing on the slideshow, we decided not to have a talk where we were speaking to individual pictures, but really just to show a cross-section of your career. And I was wondering if you would, do you have any favorite pictures? Are there some that may have gone by on the screen where you're like, these are the ones that mean the most to me looking back?
This is really hard for me. I would say more as bodies of work rather than choosing.
You don't have to answer the question I asked. You can answer a different one.
Okay. I think that my most interesting, for me, photographing in Peru, where I went several times to an area that was very undeveloped and there were not many tourists coming into the area. And I think that was one of the most fascinating experiences that I've had in my life. I ended up I left my guide at one point, and I ended up living with some nuns in a very remote part of the country. And that in itself was a huge experience for me. And they helped me to do my work. Mm-hmm. And I went back there a couple of times, a couple of other times. So that was a major experience in my life. And the other project that was really educational and exciting to me was India. Mm-hmm. Was going to Calcutta, where I went several times, and where I experienced some of the major festivals and lived with a family. I mean, I didn't live with a family there, but I was involved with this family where the man in the family had died, and he left the house to the goddess Kali. And what did that mean? It meant that the main part of the main floor was a temple. And and the family lived upstairs. Mm-hmm. And they had celebrations there, and I was able to attend some of their celebrations and to photograph them. It was fascinating to learn about that culture. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that meant a lot to me. And in Peru, too, working with the people in the mountains who had a very tough life. It was all, all of that has been educational, and it's been exciting for me and instructive to me.
Well, your work has been exciting and instructive for me, and I think for many people here. So I want to say thank you for having this talk with me. If you don't mind, we'll see if there are questions from the audience, because I think there are a lot of Rosalind fans here.
I want to say thank you to you, Sarah.
There are some joys, and you are one of them. So. So are there any questions that I would imagine one might want to ask of Rosalind? We left off huge chunks. Okay, yes. Here. Ooh. I don't know how we'll do it.
It's hard to imagine shooting in film with these types of projects. How many cases of films would you come back with?
Oh.
Because that was a lot of work.
I think sometimes that I shot about 10 or 12 rolls in a day. And that, well, each roll was 2 1/4, so there are about 12 pictures, 12 frames on 2 1/4 film. Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. You did have a question about whether I worked every day or whether I shot every day, and I never have done that. I've always gone to take pictures very specifically when I wanted to, and then when I traveled, I just worked every day. And I want to say too that when I traveled, and I was living with the nuns, I wore my hiking boots, I wore my vest, and I felt like a very strong human being. I did not feel like the little woman. I felt just like a strong person, and that meant a lot to me.
I'm glad for that, first of all, just to acknowledge that. I'd also, though, you've described, now that you're saying what you're wearing, when you were taking the photographs that are on view at the Muse booth, you described a different kind of outfit that you were wearing at that time. And I think it can be quite revealing of how someone responds when you approach them. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was really in my 40s, and I wore a photographer's vest and a kooky hat. And I wasn't threatening. People just let me take their pictures. I'd just say, "Can I take your picture?" And sometimes they would say, "What for?" And I say, "Well, maybe I'll publish it in a book someday." And that was all I had to say. And they weren't afraid of me. And somehow, I think the fact that I was a woman and that I was in my middle-aged when I started photographing, I think that helped me a lot. I wasn't a kid.
Dorothea Lange would agree. She thought that it was a distinct advantage as she approached people with her camera, that she had walked with a slight limp and that she was a diminutive woman. And she thought that this naturally allowed people to open up without that kind of relationship or extended engagement that we were talking about before. So,
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, way in the back. You're gonna have to walk up here.
Hello. I was just wondering.
Take off your mask just a second. Okay, thank you.
I was wondering if photography taught you to see the world differently, because you started later in life, and I wondered how it had changed the way you saw the world.
Would you say it again?
Yes, I was wondering if photography taught you to see the world differently and how it changed the way you saw.
Yes, I think it changed. Oh, the photography definitely helped me to see the world differently, because I was looking very closely and I was going to places that I never would have gone otherwise, or that I couldn't have gone. I would go to people's homes. They would invite me in. I had many experiences that I couldn't have had without my camera, I don't think. I wouldn't have known how to have those experiences. Thank you.
All right, one last question, anyone? Speak now. All right, well, Rosalind, thank you, and...
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of Parry Photo, and be sure to go by Muse and Julian Sonder Gallery so you can see these pictures up close and personal.